All right, thank you so much. And please let me know if you have any problems hearing me. And Megan's here to help. That was the voice of Megan, by the way. Did you introduce yourself, Megan?
No, I didn't. I don't usually introduce myself since I'm not a presenter, but yes, the tea is out. I'm Megan.
Right. The Megan Jora show, kind of like you're tuning into like a radio station. Welcome to the Megan Jora show.
I think you're on to something there, Jora.
So if you have any issues with tech or anything like that, please let Megan know, because I can't monitor the chat. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. I am appreciative of being on in East Oakland, Ohlone land, occupied land, and I am, my pronouns are they, them. I'm the Chief of Staff and Equity at WorkSafe, and I welcome you all to please introduce yourself in the chat if you want to. And I'm just going to start. I am from WorkSafe. We are really dedicated to preventing worker illness, injury, and death. And we do this by increasing worker power. We work with a lot of worker campaigns. We support very protective laws for workers. We ensure just treatment for injured workers, and we raise awareness about occupational safety and health. If you're joining us, by the way, mute your microphone. I can hear somebody walking. I love hearing footsteps, but do please mute your microphone. You are being recorded. Okay, so what's next? The next slide is, that's me. Yay. What are our goals today? We're going to provide an overview of implicit bias, and we're going to hopefully build our capacity to create strategies to address personal and organizational implicit bias. This is not an easy task, by the way, so I applaud you all for being here. I also know you have to be here. We are required as attorneys to take this course, but you know, it's an ever-growing process. So actually, the first thing I'm going to start with is a discussion of what we went through last time. So this is a two-part series. The first part was a webinar on cultural humility, and Megan could probably drop in the link for that. So that was a precursor. And if you did not attend that, I'm going to give like a real quick, maybe 1 or 2 minute, maybe more, kind of a summary of that webinar. And sorry, I think you could see all this, right? But that's just the way it is. So I want to start with a summary. And if you want a more detailed watch on that, we have it on webinar. So let's take a moment to review cultural humility, because it's going to be a fundamental part of our process of understanding implicit bias. So what is culture? Let's start with the definition. There's a popular model of culture floating around called the iceberg model. It's over here. And it's based on the definition of culture as the characteristics and knowledge of a particular group of people, which includes language, religion, cuisine, social habits, music, and arts. And this model is depicted as an iceberg with the visible characteristics on the top and the invisible characteristics, and such as worldviews and values and beliefs on the bottom. In my opinion, however, this is not really a good depiction of culture, because it fails to encompass the complexity of culture. So to me, culture is not static like an iceberg. It's actually very fluid and has the capacity to change and to be in constant motion. So another way to think about culture is that it's an ecosystem that is living and changing constantly. People within a culture are also not monolithic and flat. You know, there is a great diversity within a group as well with respect to perspectives, values, opinions, and ways of being. So we need to be aware of these as well and how they affect all those within the community. There are aspects that we nurture, that nurture the community, and it's all beneath the water, in the same way that they provide challenges, they nurture. And this water is not still. You know, there's koi fish here, there's lily pads, and there's a whole abundance of life underneath the water. So in essence, culture is very complex, and the failure to understand this can make us potentially create or actually reinforce biases and stereotypes. So in that first webinar, we talked about cultural humility as the process of increasing one's awareness of culture through personal reflection and growth and co-learning. We talked about 3 aspects of cultural humility. I'm literally just going to brush over these just because I want to have you feel like you have a foundation for the rest of the discussion on implicit bias.
Is that a podcast?
Yeah, please mute yourself. This is a webinar for the person who asked the question. It's a webinar, not a podcast. Someday Megan and I might have our own podcast. Who knows? So the first aspect of cultural humility encourages lifelong learning with no end goal, but rather an appreciation of the journey of growth and understanding. A person cannot begin to understand the makeup and context of another person's life without being aware and reflective of their own background and situation first. So this concept is really different from what people used to call cultural intelligence. This concept puts professionals and clients in a mutually beneficial relationship, as opposed to cultural intelligence, which kind of created this like cultural expert kind of dynamic. We want instead to have a mutually beneficial relationship between client and service provider, and to attempt to diminish the damaging power dynamics that make relationships challenging and getting optimal results challenging. The second aspect is to recognize power imbalances that are inherent in client and service provider and legal advocate community exchanges. So power imbalances can greatly influence our clients' legal outcomes. It's so very important to develop a true understanding of how power dynamics, implicit bias, our own identities, how we perceive the identities of others that we help, all work together to influence our experiences in the world. So having a thorough understanding of these things will help identify the different intersecting identities that can influence a client's case, and will help build and strengthen the relationship between you and your clients. The final aspect of cultural humility is institutional accountability. What are we doing as a society or as an organization to ensure cultural humility? What are our organizations in the work towards gender and racial equity? Where are we? And this is from Equity in the Center. Are we in the awake phase where we're working on representation? Are we in the work phase where we're working on addressing systemic racism and gender inequality at the root causes? Or are we in the woke phase where we are evolving our organizational culture to value all people's contributions? You could be in, have your leg in many of these different phases at the same time, by the way. So it's a fluid model. And I would encourage people to look more into this. There's a report that comes from Equity in the Center called Awake to Woke to Work. And I find it to be extremely instructive. And are we doing equity and social justice work? Are we doing what we need to do to ensure that we're getting to the justice part, and not somewhere here, equality? For many years, it was like, give everyone exactly the same thing to help people. And we've learned since then that we actually need to be very flexible. One critically important feature of cultural humility is its requirement of historical awareness. It's not enough to think about one's own values, beliefs, and social position within the context of the present. In order to practice true cultural humility, you have to be aware of and sensitive to historic realities like legacies of violence and oppression against certain groups of people. And if you tune into that webinar, I give a really extensive example of Asian American, anti-Asian American hate crimes, and how it actually sits on a root of very long-standing history in the United States. So what is implicit bias? Okay, now we're going to jump into it. So let's look at the definition that has been given here. Bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Scary, the word unconscious. It is activated involuntarily without awareness or intentional control. It can be either positive or negative, and everyone is susceptible to having implicit bias. So what I'm going to do now is play a video, because I'd like, oftentimes it's great to see how this is depicted through video format. So let's do it, and tell me if anyone can't hear this, okay?
I don't think the sound is playing, Jora.
Okay, hold on. So you didn't hear that?
Nope.
Oh, okay, let me try this again. Maybe I forgot to press the button when I shared it.
Can't hear anything.
Okay. All right, let's try this again. Start from the beginning.
For example, we often...
You heard that, right?
Yep.
All right, here we go.
Implicit bias exists when we unconsciously hold attitudes towards others or associate stereotypes with them. For example, we often harbor negative stereotypes about others without consciously realizing that we do so. Implicit bias, which is also called unconscious bias or implicit social cognition, is a prejudice that is deep-seated within the brain, below the conscious level. Studies have demonstrated implicit bias against racial groups, genders, LGBTQ, and other marginalized groups. We may even be prejudiced against our own group, although we tend to favor our in-group with positive stereotypes and disfavor out-groups with negative stereotypes.
The immediate feeling you get or the immediate thoughts you have about a person, an assumption you feel, just anything you feel really stems somewhere from an experience you've had or your upbringing.
It depends on the region you're from, the country you're from, the background you grew up in. That shapes the person's unconscious bias.
I think sometimes you don't even realize it, but your own actions, maybe the way you treat others as opposed to treating others that look like you or that act like you or that are your friends.
Implicit bias often runs counter to people's conscious, expressed beliefs. Few physicians espouse racially discriminatory views, and yet doctors tend to recommend less pain medication for Black patients than for white patients with the identical injury. In other words, people can be explicitly unbiased, yet implicitly biased, according to psychologist Daniel Kelly and colleagues.
One of my closest friends since high school, we've worked on a lot of projects together, we've been in a lot of classes together. Sometimes we'd be working together in a group project, for example, and she would say stuff like, oh, you're good at math, you're good at science, here, you can take this part of the project or something. I don't hold it against her or anything, and she doesn't mean any harm by it, but obviously there's that implicit sort of bias or stereotype that Asians are better at math and science.
Implicit bias has been found in a large array of studies using various tests, but much of the evidence for the phenomenon comes from Harvard University's Project Implicit website, home of the Implicit Association Test, or the IAT. Literally millions of people have visited this site and taken various tests that ask them to respond rapidly to questions that require them to associate Blacks or whites, males or females, or young or old, etc., with positive or negative words.
Most of the implicit biases that I've run into are probably positive ones, things that come with being a white male and having height and having a good voice and things like that.
Professor Nosek and colleagues tested more than 700,000 subjects and found that more than 70% of white subjects more easily associated white faces with positive words and Black faces with negative words, concluding that this was evidence of implicit racial bias. In fact, additional evidence indicates that measures of implicit bias better predict people's conduct than measures of explicit bias.
I think that if you are anyone, to be blunt, that it's not a white male, you potentially feel that implicit bias. Maybe you're just looking for someone that is like you because you like you, and so you want to be around more people like you. But what's really rooted under that is that you potentially don't think that someone else is as smart or as capable, and that is coming from a place of implicit bias.
Now here's some good news. Various scientists have criticized the IAT. They point out, for example, that individuals who take the test on different dates often score substantially differently. Even IAT supporters admit that implicit bias, at least as demonstrated by the test, is widespread but relatively minor and has only a small impact upon people's real-world actions. In other words, the results of the test are not strong enough to predict particular behaviors by individual people. However, let's not get too comfortable. Even if the IAT cannot predict the future conduct of any one individual on a given occasion, it still indicates how groups of people will act on average, and that is worrisome. For example, few people openly advocate for discrimination in hiring, but white applicants receive 50% more responses from potential employers than do black applicants with the same resume. Likewise, college professors are substantially more likely to answer student emails if the students' names indicate that they are probably white than if the names sound like they belong to black students. And in one study, online course instructors were 94% more likely to respond to discussion posts by white male students than by other students.
There are a lot of opportunities to promote people within the workplace. It doesn't happen because of different biases. People assume, a woman is of a certain age or they're married, and you think, oh, she's going to want to have kids, so we're not going to give her this really tough, big project.
When I graduated from West Point in 2009, I went to my first organization, the first unit assignment. I was the only Latino officer in a group of about 100 other officers. Yeah, I think there was a lot of hesitation in really following my lead as the leader for the organization. I think it hindered in some way the ability for us to build cohesive trust within our organization and really have that going into a combat environment.
Because implicit bias operates at a mostly unconscious level, it is difficult for individuals to overcome. No existing training regime has proven particularly effective at debiasing implicit bias. But, fortunately, some research shows that stereotypes can be unlearned, and that safeguards can be put in place to minimize their impact. For example, women used to make up only a relatively small percentage of the musicians in orchestras. But when orchestras began holding blind auditions, where the applicants played behind a curtain and their genders were unknown to the judges, the percentage of women chosen to play in symphony orchestras doubled. Perhaps we can put a dent in implicit bias after all.
These biases are sometimes so deep-rooted within us or within our culture that we don't even realize that they are biases.
We could have a mutually, beneficial conversation and really benefit from learning from each other and really understand that we're all not that different.
Listen, really absorb the experiences of those around you, especially those who come from backgrounds that are unlike yours.
Learn something new about a person, and then that will kind of help shift that bias, because now you've actually asked that person, or now you get to know that person.
There's so many opportunities to engage with others, to say, I don't want to do this again. Can you help me not do that? And people are willing to have those conversations.
All right, thank you. So there's hope. It ends with on a hopeful note. Today's training is going to be about identifying implicit bias. The strategies for what to do about it, I think, would require an entirely different webinar, and I'm happy to do that in the future if need be. So there are theoretically two ways that we go about understanding our world. System one is a subconscious processing, which is automatic, fast, and effortless, your reptilian brain. System two is conscious, deliberate, slow, and effortful. Implicit bias is the product of system one thinking, and we often act on them without awareness. This is why it is so hard to address it. So we're going to take a break and do an exercise. I've been talking about implicit bias for a long time, and I'd like you all now to do a little exercise to figure out who is in your world. I'm going to ask you to you can do it on your computer or a piece of paper, a pad, and you're going to write the names of 10 of the most trusted people in your life. Next to each person's name, you're going to write down their age, gender, race, highest educational level, completed marital status, and whether or not they have a disability. And I'm going to give you a few minutes to do this. This is a private reflective exercise. You do not have to share your answers. This is just for you. So let's take, 2 or 3 minutes to do this. All right, let's come back. And let's go to the next slide. All right, so your tested 10 exercise. Let's see where we fall in. So take a few minutes to reflect on your trusted 10, and we're going to ask ourselves a few questions. Again, this is reflective. If anyone really wants to, they're welcome to share in the chat. I can share with you a little bit about who I came up with. What do you notice? How like you are your trusted 10? So we have the trusted inner circle. We have comfy, which is 2, and we have haya, which is outside. So for me, of course, my most trusted is my immediate family, my spouse and my child. My spouse is Black, my child is Blasian, and then outside, I have a very close group of friends who are women of color, who've been my friends for 30 or so years, and also a very trusted group of white women that I have known and I call my sisters as well, and a group of people who have a disability, a mental health disability as well. And out here on my number 3 would be my coworkers, who are very diverse in race, ethnicity, gender, and disability. So how about you? What perspectives out of these folks that you've listed, the 10 that you that are missing? Whose perspectives do you have in your trusted 10 that are missing? All right, so that's more of a self-reflection. If you join us for our first webinar on cultural humility, you know, a large part of this process really is internal, looking at yourself and how you relate to the world. So the rest of this webinar is going to look at how this turns up in the legal profession. So let me take a second to do that. Okay. So we're going to talk about 3 types of bias. Sometimes for some people, it's really comforting, or they find great comfort in identifying and categorizing bias so that it helps them understand exactly what it is that's going on. And so we're going to try to do that. And as I was making this training, I realized that actually some of these examples that I'm going to give you kind of like intersect with each other. But anyway, we're gonna do our best and give it a try. So the first type of bias we'll talk about is systemic bias, and this occurs when unconscious bias unintentionally becomes embedded at the organizational systemic level. And I'm sure as I was writing that last night, I'm like, well, sometimes it's not unintentional. Sometimes it's actually quite intentional. You know, systemic bias. Like if you look at some of the anti-Asian laws that were instituted in 1890s, that was pretty intentional. But we're gonna break this down and look at how it can become unintentional. Well, you know, that's the whole purpose of this, is to look at implicit bias. So implicit or unconscious bias is prejudice, bigotry, or unfairness directed by someone from a privileged group towards individuals from an oppressed or marginalized group. So that's what we've been talking about, implicit bias. Systemic bias is prejudice, bigotry, or unfairness directed by health, educational, government, judicial, legal, religious, political, financial, media, or cultural institutions towards individuals of an oppressed or marginalized group. So as an example of this, I wanted to take a look at mass incarceration in California. California, in comparison to the other states, California is often considered one of the most progressive states in the nation. Many Californians pride themselves on being progressive in addressing racism more in a better way than other states. Several studies have been conducted analyzing data such as racial slurs on Twitter, racist Google searches. I'm sure there's many more ways of doing this, but this is what I looked at. So these studies took a look at Google searches and tweet feeds, and these noted that the most, they kind of counted the most amount of racial slurs or racist searches and created this map of the United States. The ones in blue are the states that have been found to be have the most racist kind of searches. And as you can see, like Louisiana's here, Georgia's here, even New York is here. So I also kind of took a look at some of the top 10 racist states and found this about another state, Mississippi.
So who knows? Maybe Mississippi is actually the worst. I mean, they have the 8th largest employment gap by race and the 12th largest income gap, even with the lowest incomes in the nation. Heck, last year actually marked the first time in history that Mississippi voters opted to remove a Jim Crow era law from their constitution. The provision, which was designed to prevent Black Americans from holding office, made Mississippi the only state that could withhold a person from winning an election, even if they garnered a majority of the vote. And I guess it worked, because a Black candidate has never been elected to any statewide office here, despite it being the blackest state in the country.
So this little YouTube video went through all the top 10, and California was not one of them. So
who knows? Maybe Mississippi.
Again. Let's go to the next slide. So taking a look at mass incarceration. It's actually worse in California than in any other states. Black men are 8 times more likely to be incarcerated in California than white men. And they're only 3 times, well, not only, but it's just as terrible, but in Mississippi, it's a 3 to 1 count. And in Louisiana, it's 4 to 1 count. Similarly with Latinx men, they're 2 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men. And this is worse than states that we typically might think are more racist, such as Texas, Nevada, or Oregon. So what the heck is going on in California? All right, sorry, that was depressing, but that was an example of systemic bias. We're just going to move through examples. We won't explore so much why, but now you have it in your mind to kind of take a look at, what is going on in California with regard to mass incarceration and implicit bias. Now let's look at affinity bias. Affinity bias is prevalent in the legal community. This is the tendency to gravitate towards and develop relationships with people who are more like us and share common interests or backgrounds with us. This leads people to investing more time and resources in those who are in their own affinity group, while unintentionally leaving others out. So we're going to take a look at an example, and this specifically is the People versus Turner, I believe is the name. So this is the situation many of us are very familiar with. This is the case of Brock Turner, who was convicted on March 30th, 2016 by a jury of 3 counts of felony sexual assaults against Chanel Miller, who was unconscious at the time. This occurred on January 18th, 2015 at Stanford University. This sentence included the requirement to register as a sex offender. So Brock Turner was a 19-year-old freshman at Stanford who was attending on a swimming scholarship. And we know this because that's all the media said. It would really emphasize Turner's swimming scholarship, pictures of him swimming, the potential and his potential to become a part of the 2016 Olympic team. That was his goal. Prosecutors at the end of the trial recommended that Turner be given a 6-year prison sentence based on the purposefulness of the action that he engaged in, the effort to hide his activity, and Chanel Miller's intoxicated state. Santa Clara County.
Are you still there?
You talking to me? Hopefully you guys can hear me because I've been talking this whole time.
I don't think they were talking to you, Jora. I think you.
Oh, okay. All right. Good. I was like, oh, I've just been going on and on and on. Okay. Okay. Right. Okay. Let's go back. So probation officers recommended a moderate county jail sentence. Evidence of unwanted physical advances against another woman was not mentioned in the probation report. The California Penal Code's statutory minimum is 2 years, but a judge is allowed to reduce this after considering the defendant's lack of criminal history and the effect of incarceration. So on June 2nd, 2016, Judge Aaron Persky sentenced Turner to 6 months in Santa Clara County Jail, followed by 3 years of probation and the requirement to register. After 3 months in jail, half of his sentence time, he was released for good behavior. So as you all may have remembered, prosecutors and victims' rights advocates were outraged. They criticized Persky's sentencing as lenient and biased. Persky himself had been a student and a lacrosse team captain at Stanford University. So we all know the ending to this very public story. There was a huge recall effort against the judge. Recall campaign organizers claimed that Persky had a history of showing bias against women and defendants of color in multiple sex crime cases. They pulled out at least one other case that was very egregious. The campaign to unseat Persky resulted in a ballot initiative. The judge pulled in many supporters to speak on his behalf, but voters decided differently. On June 5th of 2018 primary election, nearly 200,000 Santa Clara County voters turned out, voting to remove Persky by 61.51%. That was over 61.51% to 38.49%, which is a margin of 23%. So he was the first judge to be recalled by voters in California in 86 years, and the first in the United States since 1977. Since then, researchers have gone back and studied the results of this. One study, a 2022 study, found that the recall of Persky subsequently led California judges to give even more punitive sentencing. And I have the stick this case in the chat for anyone who's interested in kind of exploring this a little bit more.
Jora, I think there was a question in the chat as well from your when you were showing the previous video regarding some of the most like racist states. It says, but does that adjust for population, that one?
Well, does that adjust when you say more likely? Is that the percentage of prison populated, percentage of the overall when you say like more, is it the percentage of prison population overall? I believe it's based on overall population, and I can also go back and give the study of that. That's by the Ella Baker Center that whose report I read. So hopefully that answers the question. So anyway, let's go back to this. So this leads to a very difficult question: who actually bears the burden when we demand harsher punishment for a privileged white defendant? And I could point you to a documentary. It's a 20-minute documentary that was shown on MSNBC on March 19th, just recently, about what actually is what came out of it. Yes, we know that Judge Persky's bias in the case was called to question. He was recalled, but then what happened afterwards? So that's also of interest. All right, sorry, this training is all about giving you definitions and not necessarily answers that will make you feel better. Confirmation bias. Now let's move to confirmation bias. What is confirmation bias? This bias draws from pre-existing perceptions, images, and assumptions or stereotypes. Confirmation bias, sometimes people call it my side bias, refers to the tendency to seek out and give undue credibility or value to information that supports one's own opinion or ideal version of events. When a human being is confronted with a series of events or evidence, they will adopt a hypothesis to explain them. That's pretty normal. Something happened, we as humans try to figure out what happened in our own head. Confirmation bias is the tendency for us to seek out and give more weight to evidence that supports the hypotheses that we believe in, that we believe is true, or the world that we believe, and to ignore evidence which disproves that it. Because of this, a person may unduly discredit contradictory information because it doesn't support their opinion. So we're going to look at an example of this through racialized perceptions of writing skills. And the study I'm relying on is written in black and white, which explores confirmation bias in racialized perceptions of writing skills. It was a study that was done by NextGens. I believe I'm pronouncing that right. Think smarter, lead better. And they had done a previous study where they found that supervising lawyers were more likely than not to perceive African-American lawyers as having subpar writing skills in comparison to their Caucasian counterparts. So this study asked, does confirmation bias unconsciously cause supervising lawyers to more negatively evaluate legal writing by an African-American lawyer? So in this study, researchers worked with 5 partners from 5 different law firms to draft a research memo from a hypothetical third-year litigation associate named Thomas Meyer. The memo was about trade secrets in internet startups and used basic legal format, the questions presented, brief answer, facts, discussion, and conclusion. So pretty run-of-the-mill. For this, they intentionally put in 22 deliberate errors. There were 7 minor spelling errors, spelling/grammar errors, 6 substantive technical writing errors, 5 errors in fact, and 4 errors in the analysis of the facts. They then distributed the memo to 60 partners who had all previously agreed to participate in a writing analysis study. And these partners represented, they kind of came from 22 different law firms, 23 of them identified as women, 37 identified as men. And there were 12 racial ethnic minority groups represented and 39 Caucasian. So actually, let me go back to the slide real quick. So all the partners received the same exact memo. Half of the partners, so 30, received a memo that stated that the associate was African American, while the other half received a memo that stated that the associate was Caucasian. So the partners were then asked to edit the memo for all factual, technical, and substantive errors and rate the overall quality of the memo from 1 to 5, with 1 indicating the memo was extremely poorly written and 5 being extremely well written. So after a little bit of wrangling, these are busy partners, they got 53 partners to complete the study. Of the 53, 24 who turned them in received the memo by the African-American Thomas Meyer. 29 of those received the memo by the Caucasian Thomas Meyer. So the findings of the study were, with the exact same memo, the Caucasian memo was rated 4.1 out of 5, averaging, whereas the African-American Thomas Meyer memo was rated 3.2 out of 5, again, averaging. The notes, as you can see here, were more positive, tended to be more positive, whereas the notes for Thomas Meyer, noted as African-American, were less positive in comparison. With respect to errors, there in general was a kind of like finding of more errors in the African-American memo versus the one that was believed to be written by the Caucasian Thomas Meyer. Just for your information, there was no significant correlation between a partner's race or ethnicity and the differentiated patterns of errors found between the 2 memos. There was also no significant correlation between a partner's gender and the differentiation of, between the errors. And they did find, however, that female partners generally found more errors and wrote longer narratives than the male partners in general. So what are the takeaways? Key takeaways are there are commonly held racially biased perceptions about writing ability that unconsciously impacts our ability to objectively evaluate a lawyer's writing. Most of the perceptions so far indicate that commonly held perceptions are biased against African Americans and in favor of Caucasians, at least with respect to legal writing by lawyers, supervising lawyers. And the problem is that these commonly held perceptions translates into confirmation bias in a way that can impact the, to me, not only the way we evaluate legal writing, but the way that we possibly address attorneys of diverse attorneys in our legal practices with respect to salary, promotion, opportunities. We see more errors when we expect more errors, and we see fewer errors when we do not expect to see errors. So affinity bias is pretty prevalent in the legal community, and so are many other biases. And a myth that well, something I often hear, which is a myth, is people say, I'm not biased. I have like this group of diverse friends. I've grown up in diversity all my life. I believe in equal treatment of others. I work in nonprofit legal services. I'm dedicated. I'm passionate about this. I serve on a race equity committee at my office. But the sad truth, as we've learned in this, is that we all actually do have implicit biases. And it does affect our cases, or the way we relate with people, the way we provide services. And rather than trying to deny it or wipe it away, it's more critical to realize it and explore deeply your culture in your cultural humility, engaging cultural humility with respect to understanding how you may have biases that jump up. Some examples of how it can manifest. These are just examples that I've heard in my personal practice. I mean, sorry, not my personal practice, just in my career. Spoken to a single mother, a trial would be time consuming and I advise you to settle so you don't have to take time off work. Spoken to a formerly incarcerated defendant, it'll be hard to represent this client because he, she, they used to be in prison. Regarding a client having or living with HIV/AIDS, we should accept this case because we need to fulfill a grant requirement. Regarding a domestic violence client, you never called the cops, so this case is just not going to win. So some tips. Listen to your client. Your client is the authentic storyteller. They know more about their situation than you ever will. Don't make assumptions about your clients. Don't patronize your client or assume that he, she, they will be unable to participate in trial, settlement discussions, or any other aspect of their legal case. Rather than saying you won't win your case because plaintiff said you should give the person information about what is needed to prove their case. Make an evidence chart, for example. You may need a copy of, for example, you could say you may need a copy of your lease or pictures from a certain time frame, doctor's letters, or even proof. Basically, try to obtain as much evidence as possible and explain why all of these things are critical for a trial, as opposed to just assuming right out that you won't win because. Ensure that your case acceptance guidelines are uniformly applied to every potential client. Don't accept a client based on likability. Do not pass on a client because you think they have a weak case, especially if you do not do any other further investigation. And don't accept a client solely because you think it will be great to meet a quota, deliverable, tell a compelling story, have the rare, client, a token client. And what can you do about it? So awareness is the first step. Being aware of barriers, identifying problem areas in your own thinking, and continuing to engage in your own personal growth with respect to understanding your various intersectional identities as well as others. Pay attention to your own affinity bias, and if you and be intentional in interrupting and eliminating it. Ask yourself, how have you benefited from affinity bias in your career at the expense of others, if that's the case? Who are your favorite go-to attorneys in the office, in a practice group? With whom do you spend your discretionary time with, and who don't you? And I guess this is more for managers, but if you're a manager or supervisor, ask yourself, do I hold back on assigning work to other attorneys from underrepresented groups until someone vouches for their abilities? Or who do I avoid interacting with or having candid feedback because I don't know how to relate to certain people? And to whom do I give second chances? Is it more of those people, folks in my group, quote unquote? And a Jamboard. I wanted to jump to the Jamboard if we had time, and we do have time. So I wanted to give people an opportunity to kind of reflect on what they could do better to kind of address some of the bias that may be present in their life, either something that they're experiencing, bias that you're experiencing, or bias that you may be engaging in. So it's literally a blank Jamboard. Let me see if I can get it in here. Yeah. So here it is. I feel like I made it open to everybody. And I would just encourage people to jump on and just, throw some things on there so we can do some group sharing. Give you all a couple seconds to participate.
Can you put what everyone's supposed to respond to in the chat, just in case, Jora?
Sure, yeah. All right, so we see some things. I'll just read them out loud. Listen carefully to everyone. Consider whose voices and perspectives are missing. Think before making a decision. Pause. Be cautious. Yes, pause. Rethink how we consider and vet our case acceptance decisions. That's a really excellent one. Awesome. Well, y'all can continue doing that. In the meantime, I will see if there are any questions. I feel like I might be at the end of this. Yes, I might be. I believe I'm at the end of this. So if there are any questions, I can answer them too. I don't know if I can. I'm not an expert or anything. So consider places to make the process blind, right? I wish there was another word for that. I'm trying to figure out another word because I hear it often. Like, I don't know. Someone can think of another word. Let me know. Self-reflection on actions taken, assumptions made. Consider play. Try to listen fully without thinking about a response right away. Examine how you came to your opinions about people or situations. In the meantime, let me see if I can think of a better way to say than the word blind.
I think someone's raising their hands and
That
has a
me.
question.
Jora.
And my question actually maybe is kind of related to your idea about making it blind, because when you were talking about implicit bias, it really reminded me of something I'd heard like a week ago on the radio about people looking at using artificial intelligence, and they were talking in a medical context. But they brought up the issue of that artificial intelligence would seem like a blank slate, but depending on where it's getting its data, it can just sort of replicate bias
Right.
present in the data. So they were saying they had a program that they'd been educating only with like scientific journals and whatnot, but they asked it to finish a sentence about a case history of a patient who came in and was aggressive and violent. And when the person was listed as being Caucasian, white, then they would say patient was sent to hospital. When they were listed as being Black, African American, or African, they would say patient was sent to jail.
Oh, interesting.
That was an example of, it would seem like we're trying to create something blind,
But not.
but the biases are getting pulled out, and the artificial intelligence was smart enough to see that the correlation existed.
Yeah, because
So,
they're
I was
pulling
curious if
from.
you had any thoughts about the kind of, I mean, I think people have raised a lot of concerns in general, like if people are creating artificial intelligence, but the data set is coming from already a biased perspective,
Yes.
how do we address that?
Yes, that's so wow. I hadn't even thought about that. Like you're trying to use software, you're trying to create an app, for example, or some algorithm or some filtration system to improve your already implicit bias in your head. But if the creators themselves have biases, and if they're using Google data, for example, or demographic data or numerical data, I don't know the answer to that question. I think I probably would say that you would need you need to incorporate that as an evaluation process, or a process of thinking of how to do it to address that problem in the first place. Like do you write your software programs that will pull from data that already is problematic? Do you somehow address the problematic issues in the data? I don't know. That's a very good point, Aurora. Thank you. All right. I had a couple more. Reflecting after a call with a client, see what assumptions I made and incorporating those lessons in my future calls. Try to listen without thinking about a response right away. All right. Any more questions? If not, I might give you back 8 minutes of your day. All right. I see none. You see none, right, Megan?
I don't see any. I think Stephen put in the chats in response to you inquiring as to if there's a better word for
Objective.
Consider places
Yes.
to make the process blind. Yeah, objective.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. I like that. Will you do the training on yeah, what about what to do about it? I'd love to do something so I can chat with Megan about it. There are many different, but it's one of those trainings that you really need to do in person. It's not a webinar kind of thing. It's like I think in person's better. So I don't know, I'll chat with Lack about it. What can we do for our next step? So at WorkSafe, we have an internal race equity or diversity and inclusion kind of committee. And I think I would say for your next step, it would be to incorporate serious kind of programmatic work around implicit bias at your legal aid organization, where you talk about it, like, depending on how you do legal work. So for example, if you take cases based on legal clinics, identify what biases may come up in accepting cases and then processing them, and then try to create systems that are objective. Thank you, Stephen. The word. That's what I would say would be the next step. We do better, in my opinion, in community with those that we work with, in solidarity with other folks in other legal aids as well. And so form a network and reach out and try to find a way to solve issues. For LAC, I do believe there is a pro bono anti-racist group that's kind of thinking through things all the time, but that's with respect to pro bono work. But I think that you could do that with many. LAC also has a DEI committee, and we have a toolkit out. So I reference that as well for some potential tools. All right, thank you all so much. Please take 6 minutes back to your day and do whatever that it is that you want to do with those 6 minutes. Thank you for coming. And I'll stay on with you, Megan, and anyone else who wants to kick it with us. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. This webinar was hosted by the Legal Aid Association of California, also known as LAC. We are the membership organization for California's civil legal aid nonprofits. Our job is to advocate in the legislature, in the courts, and with the State Bar of California on behalf of the community of nonprofits that serve low-income Californians. In addition to our online and in-person trainings, LAC provides coordination and advocacy for increased funding to support organizations like yours. Thank you.